All right. So today I have my good friend Andrew Burt, co-founder of Luminos.ai and Luminos.Law. Both of these entities are focused on mitigating risks in AIs, particularly to make AI legally compliant. And full disclosure, I'm an advisor to both of these entities. So Andrew, welcome as always to the Data Exchange Podcast.
Thank you very much. My favorite podcast on the planet, and it's great to be back.
And so then we've been talking to Andrew over the years about risk in AI, and to a large extent, a lot of our discussions were somewhat ahead of its time and maybe somewhat still kind of what if. But now Andrew has a few years under his belt of actually working with companies and advising clients. And so today I thought we do a deep dive into one particular aspect of all of this, which is what happens when something goes wrong. You actually deploy a model, which I'm assuming some of our listeners are in the early stages of deploying some models, and something goes wrong. So what exactly do you do? So we will label this, broadly speaking, as incident response, which is something that people in other areas of software engineering are familiar with. But obviously now we have models and data involved, so there's an AI twist. So Andrew, incident response in detail. So step one, I get an alert. What do I do?
So honestly, you're not going to get an alert. That's the thing that's really interesting about AI. You have to really start from the basics. One thing I'll say, just to kind of get listeners, I don't know, on the same page, a little bit of background is for the last maybe 2 decades, incident response in traditional software systems has been really it's become a mature field. There are companies that do AI, traditional incident response. I myself, I worked at the FBI Cyber Division. I got certified as a cyber incident responder. So there are courses and certifications. This is a mature discipline. There is nothing for AI incidents. There are model monitoring, detection systems that'll give you alerts, but those are really only going to give you alerts on changes in accuracy. There are no real mature practices for identifying incidents and then responding to them. And so the first question, Ben, about I'm going to get an alert, most companies don't get alerts. In fact, one of the major ways that they discover there's been an incident is social media, sometimes news articles. One of the ones that we kind of think a lot about just because it's pretty emblematic, and also it happened a long time ago, which gives you a sense of kind of the history here and how many incidents are happening today, is almost 10 years ago, I think in 2016, Google had this major incident with it had a system that was doing object recognition in photos, and the system consistently labeled Black people gorillas, and it was a huge incident. And the public got involved. It was originally actually alerted or identified via social media on Twitter. That's very bad. And the way Google handled it is just really instructive. So anyway, there are no alerts for this system is, potentially engaging in racist behavior. So anyway, the first thing you need to do is prepare for it. And part of that is the first step is defining what is an incident. Is, incorrect object entity detection. Is that an incident? Probably not, but there are some.
Fast forwarding to modern times, Andrew, with the large language models, the model spews out something.
Exactly.
It's far from something you would want it to respond, right? So,
yeah, but this is why it's so interesting, because is hallucination an incident? Probably not. Maybe there's some circumstances. And the reason why AI is so different is because these systems are probabilistic, which means they will be wrong. And the goal is to have that percentage of the time be really small, but you are guaranteed to have unintended behavior, which means you're guaranteed to have incidents, which means you need to prepare for them. And companies are really only just starting to think about that now. So
defining an incident obviously is very application and domain specific. So what is the kind of the best practice for defining what is an incident? Does it have to cross a legal threshold, or is there a PR meter that you have to, you get a certain amount of backlash from the public and that's an incident?
So it really depends. Different companies are going to have, different uses for their models, and they're going to have different risk appetites. And so there are different ways to define incidents. The way, and in fact, if you want, I can pull it up. But like again, there are playbooks for incident response for traditional software systems, and they basically all largely define incidents largely based on bad guys doing bad things. Someone violates some terms of service or authorized use, or they try to break confidentiality or integrity or availability. Again, very different with AI systems. The way we tend to approach it is basically unintended behavior of a system that causes or potentially causes harms to users or the companies that are using it. And so what we tend to think of is not necessarily this is a bad guy doing bad things, but the model is creating unexpected harms. And so again, just to go to hallucinations, it's a really tricky question. There are some models where hallucinations are basically just part of what you're doing. There are other models, let's say when you're engaging in a model for legal advice, hallucinations actually could lead to an incident because then you're giving wrong legal advice, and there could be legal ramifications. So this stuff is really important to think about before it happens.
So the first thing that your team needs to do then is to come up with a different definition of incidents with the caveat that there's different degrees or levels of incidents, and then your response and playbook will vary based on the level.
That's exactly right. And so, okay, what we're seeing right now in the market is there are two types of incidents. There's one where companies have prepared. Not a lot of companies are doing that, just to like set everyone's expectations.
Well, give us a percentage. I mean, a guesstimate.
97% of companies are not ready for this.
Even in this two category classification.
Yeah. So they're the ones that have not prepared, 97, maybe even more. There's such hype associated with AI. There's such a rush to get in the market and plant your flag that not only is it hard for them to think about what happens if something goes wrong, that's different from AI incident response. So like, a lot of it has to do with accuracy. If the performance of this model degrades, what do we do? A lot of thought goes into that. But so that's most companies are not prepared at all for that's going to change. It's not going to be optional. For the companies that do want to prepare, there are two major things that they can do. One, put together policies. So just like literally what happens? How do we define an AI incident response? Who is the actual team and what people respond? Are they internal? Are they external? Very frequently, like external lawyers get involved. Is it internal? So there are all of these questions. And then I will just say the most important lesson from having done this for a really long time, there's nothing more important than having short-term containment plans. So the difference between basically a disastrous incident response and one that goes well is have the data scientists, have the business units, has the company, do they have a plan on the shelf for what to do if something goes wrong? So basically appending some type of rules-based approach to change the model behavior, having some backup version that they can put in place of the actual model, having something that says, here's what we're going to do if basically we need to drastically change model behavior. And literally having that is the distinction between a successful incident response and an unsuccessful incident response. And the reason is because AI systems are super complicated. They're super brittle. When something goes wrong, it can take weeks or even months to figure out why and to diagnose it and to come up with ways to fix it. And so if the incident is bad, you can't just wait that long to take action. And so a short-term containment plan is what allows the actual incident response to be successful. But again, when we do incident response, it's very rare that companies have all of these things in place. And so frequently, it's a mess.
And even Andrew, as you're talking there, the short-term containment plan, I guess it depends on how much you rely on the AI for the specific application, right? So if the AI is at the heart of the application, and your containment plan is to essentially kind of remove a lot of the AI's capabilities, that changes the application drastically, right? So, but then depending on the incident, you may have to prepare yourself to do just that, right?
Exactly. And that's why this can be really tricky for companies. And so in very stressful, time-constrained circumstances, for these ones that are, like really central, these systems that are really central, they frequently have to decide, do we just kill this? Or do we let it keep making, mistakes? I talked about the Google example with the gorillas. One other one that it kind of like seems innocuous, but I think it's actually a pretty good illustration is, I think it was Air Canada that got in trouble recently. They they got in trouble. Their chatbot gave incorrect information related to like compensating travelers for grievance fares. Anyway, that's very specific, but there have been instances of like airlines or whatever, car dealerships giving wrong prices for tickets or cars. And that's a really interesting example because let's say I'm an airline and my chatbot says, okay, I'll sell tickets for $1. What do you do? So like a bunch of users are going to buy tickets for $1. That's going to be an issue. And then the real question is, okay, what do you do? And in some cases, a company will just basically want to stop the functionality of being able to buy tickets through these systems. And that's a pretty big decision to make in terms of business impact. And so when you have incidents like this, you have to very quickly respond and make big business decisions. And if you don't have short-term plans in place, you're just really constrained in terms of what your options are.
And Andrew, the connection between incident response and the development and testing of the model, right? So I'm sure some listeners are saying, in traditional software, obviously, as you alluded to, there's a long tradition of incident response, meaning they just assume that no matter how much testing they do, something is going to go wrong, so we need to be prepared. So in the AI case, I think right now people are, I would say there's almost like two camps, right? So there's a camp that does very minimal testing. I mean, everyone does some testing. And then there's one camp that does less testing, and then there's a camp that does a lot of testing. But in both cases, you should treat it like traditional software in that you have to assume that no matter how much testing you do, something will go wrong, something you don't expect will happen, will happen. So depending on the gravity of what it is that goes wrong, you may have to quickly go back to the drawing board and rebuild the model from scratch, or maybe all you have to do is tweak it. But in any case, there has to be a connection between the people doing the incident response and those building the model, correct?
That's exactly right. And the thing that is really important with AI, just risk management, like writ large, is so you can do stuff before something bad happens. And that's, you do QA and other stuff that's not completely related, but I know it's in the same world. So you can try to prevent it before it happens, and then you can try to detect it and respond as quickly as possible once it occurs. And so there's a really interesting concept, mean time to response versus mean time to repair. And so the traditional, basically the traditional approach to this was we basically want to respond as quickly as possible. And basically, well, I'm not going to get into all of the difference, but basically the idea was you respond. Sorry, I'm getting completely off track and I'm getting very, very distracted. But in the traditional software world, you don't have the same types of failures and they're not guaranteed. And in the AI world, you basically can't do full risk management unless you can detect it very quickly. So it's all basically part of the process. Again, because failures are guaranteed to happen when you're using AI in a way that they're not guaranteed to happen when you're using software.
So if you map what we've been talking about in the context of large language models, which a lot of people listening to this podcast are starting to build applications around, right? So here's a case where there's a couple of scenarios, right? So one scenario is you're using an external API where in many ways you don't even control the model, right? So there's another scenario where maybe you control the model and you've done a lot of work fine-tuning it, attaching it to a vector database, so doing some retrieval augmented generation, and so on and so forth. So do you make a distinction between those two types of scenarios where one, I have more control, the model is mine. The other one is I don't actually control the model, but for some reason I've come to rely on it.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of, and we could talk about the phases of incident response, in terms of like formally, what do you do? How do you structure it into phases? Who is involved? That doesn't really change. Like with traditional incident response, there's like a playbook, and this is what you do. And part of what we've done at the firm, I should also say, we do a lot of research on this. And at the law firm, we've done research for NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, specifically focused on this. So the goal there should be, and what we're trying to do is help write that playbook for AI incident response. And so we have our own internal playbook. So that should be the same. The exact system and like the architecture of how you're responding, that ends up basically dictating what your options are. So if you're using an external API and you don't have a lot of control over that system, you're just going to have, frankly, a lot, less.
But the reason I make that distinction is, so I'm being cheeky here, so I'm smiling for people who are not watching the video, is that in the external API scenario, maybe if there's a backlash, the backlash is against the model provider, not you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, but the truth is that it's not. I mean, again, everything depends on the actual system. But if this is a high impact system, it's not really going to matter. Like the airline, the Google Gorilla. I mean, there's actually something called the AI incident database that catalogs like thousands of all of these incidents. And it's really ultimately on, primarily on the actual organization that has their name on the system. So you can't really hand off full liability. I guess, from a legal standpoint, you can try to hand off liability, but if this is public, if this is a major incident, it's going to hurt your reputational, your reputation. So you can't just say, okay, this is not our model, it's not on us.
So you treat it the same way. So you talked about phases. So I guess the preparatory phase is to define what an incident is. So quickly walk us through some of the phases.
Yeah, okay. And so all of this, so these are the same phases as traditional incident response. The difference is what they're composed of and what you actually do. So it starts with preparation. How do you get all the pieces in place? We can talk about, exactly what these things mean later, but it goes preparation, identification. So in practice, do I get an alert? Am I monitoring social media? Like, how is it that I understand an incident has taken place? And then I would say the real work takes place, but it's actually way harder to do preparation and identification. You then do containment, eradication, and recovery, basically stop the bleeding, figure out exactly what's going on, and then try to get the system and restore it to its original functionality. And then after that, so those are the first 5 phases. Then after that, you do something called lessons learned. That's also really important because after incidents, it's very easy. There's a lot of chaos. Incidents are extremely stressful. What you want to make sure you do is step back, figure out what you learned, and then basically put all of that into the preparation, the policies, so that when the next incident occurs, and it will, you're basically better. You can respond faster. And usually what we see in practice is the first incident will get called in. There are a variety of reasons of why folks call us. And there's not a lot of structure there. There's not preparation done. The ways they identify incidents are very subpar. Once that incident actually takes place, then we start to see, okay, lessons learned. How can we then put in place a full preparation and basically all of those stages? But again, that's the playbook, and you can take that playbook, apply it to AI systems. The difference is what actually happens in each of those phases is different. Like, how do you contain or eradicate, hallucination in a language model that's doing, legal analysis? How do you contain or eradicate, again, the Google model? So I'm gonna pause there, but we can dive into each phase if you want.
As you alluded to, right? So there's a long tradition of incident response in traditional software. So AI is software. It's just a software that depends on models and data. Um, and so to what extent do the companies you work with, since I'm presuming they've deployed software in the past, they already have some of these building blocks in place? And to what extent have they kind of updated it for AI and for generative AI?
So everyone is still learning. And again, what we see, and this shouldn't be the case, but we see it, is the first incident, maybe even the first couple incidents, there's not a lot of preparation there. There's not a lot there.
But they have incident response for traditional software.
Yeah,
So do
exactly.
they have a process for that?
Yes. They have a process. Again, traditional incident response for information security is a very mature field. So there's incident response teams, there are incident response contractors. Companies know how to do this. When AI incidents happen and they're not prepared, it's a mess. We call it FAQs, like for frantically asked questions. But typically what will happen is the incident response team will just get tagged in. They won't know what to do. They have no real experience with AI systems. They haven't really defined what AI incidents are. And kind of under the gun with a lot of pressure and confusion, they'll loop in data scientists and the business unit and PR and legal and whatever it is and try to figure out what to do. That's not how you want things to happen. It's kind of like if you need like emergency surgery, going to like your family doctor and saying help, like you just don't want to do that. And so what we see is after the first incident or, whatever it is, couple incidents, the expertise of those traditional teams will somehow get incorporated to something that's specific for AI. And so there are a bunch of ways to do it. You can stand up a separate AI incident response team. You can have separate plans and policies for here's what happens when it's an AI incident. And so basically, the traditional AI response team will break off or will incorporate data scientists in some special way. But on its own, like the existing incident response for cybersecurity, it just does not work. It's largely geared around trying to find the bad guy and kick him out of the network. And that's just not how AI incidents work.
So there's traditional AI and traditional machine learning, and now we have generative AI. So does the playbook need to be updated for generative AI?
Yeah, honestly, the challenges are really exacerbated when you're talking about Gen AI systems. It's kind of like a scale of like how applicable the traditional playbook is. You can kind of, not easily, but you can kind of apply it to traditional AI systems. Once you get to like language models and other generative AI systems, it really goes out the window. Again, like think about an incident, think about something bad that could happen. It's hard for me because we've done so many of these. I don't want to actually like name,
Yeah.
clients and stuff we worked on, but a generative AI model generates images it shouldn't, or a language model suddenly provides either a bunch of misinformation or information about how to, I don't know, create drugs or weapons or do some bad thing. How do you contain that? How do you eradicate that? How do you recover from that? Those three phases, again, really kind of intuitive when there's a bad person, trying to steal your files. Like that makes sense. You close off the network, you figure out how they got in, you fix those vulnerabilities and patch them, and then the bad person's not going to get in through that, that opening anymore. But when you're dealing with these Gen AI problems, it's really, really difficult. And in some cases, you can't really contain it. You can't fully eradicate it. And then you have to think about, okay, what does it mean to recover from them? Like, what are the different ways we can minimize the chance of this happening again? Like the thing that's really different is these systems are very imperfect and they're probabilistic. So bad things are going to happen. The question is, what do you do when they occur?
So I'm sure some listeners are saying, we're now in a world where I can build something impressive and interesting in less than a week. Now people are telling me I have to test it for 10 weeks. And then now Andrew is telling me now I have to test it even more and also create a playbook for when my impressive system will go wrong. So there's a lot of hurdles now that I have to jump through just when I'm at the point where I can actually build interesting stuff.
So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is like, for those listeners, congratulations. Like you've made it to the big time. AI is really seriously becoming adopted. And because of that, your responsibilities are increasing. So like it's a testament to how successful AI is being relied on that suddenly, we're not like playing with technology in a garage. We're like building technology and deploying it in a way that really impacts a lot of people. So this just kind of comes with the territory. That being said, it's a scale. No one is saying risk management efforts need to be perfect. I think AI incident response is really, really, really interesting, largely because you can do it in a way that applies to all AI systems. It's not about like testing your system forever. It's not about making, an AI system in 1 week. You don't have to spend 10 weeks, you don't have to spend that long testing it. If you are smart about AI incident response, you can detect an incident right when it occurs, and then you can basically try to minimize its impact that way. And so it frequently gets overlooked, and it shouldn't. In fact, the smarter you are about AI incident response, the easier it's going to be to prepare for when things go badly, because you can say, here's how I'm going to detect it, here's how I'm going to minimize the harm. And so I would actually say, if you're thinking about incident response the right way, you're going to make your life a lot easier in terms of testing for all the things that can go wrong.
So the first two phases, right? So I guess so first you have to define what an incident is for the specific application involving, let's say, generative AI. And then you have to put some things in place to detect it, right? So let's stop there for now. So two questions, I guess. The first one, is more just an assessment of where we are. So those two things, what percentage of people do you think are doing just those two things, are already doing those two things?
Again, a very small percent. I mean, really what we see is it takes an incident for companies to
Okay.
then do all of these things. And so we're seeing incidents happen more and more. Honestly, I would say for most companies, it might even take more than one incident. Again, the really interesting thing is we've been through this with information security like 20 years ago, and the big changes that started to happen is laws started to be enacted specifically focused on, on data breaches and whatever it was. And that changed the tone. And we are basically seeing that right now. We have the EU AI Act. We have what Colorado just passed. California is
Oh, come
very,
on.
yeah. So
I'm not a fan of SB 1047, as you know.
I'm
But
very well aware, but this stuff is
yeah,
coming, and it's
yeah.
basically going to mean it's harder to get away with having an incident and not doing a lot about it. But again, I'll say this is something that companies are only just starting to take seriously. And it makes sense. AI is being deployed, especially Gen AI is being deployed a lot more widely. But I would say,
So the defining what an incident is and detecting it. Um, so are there starting to be tools and best practices in your mind? I mean, you folks at Luminos.ai, I think, are starting to build some of the tools, right? But generally, when you go into a company, um, what are people doing? So are they just in the defining what an incident is and detecting it? The ones that are doing something, what are they using and what are they doing? And do you find that uh, is what they're doing enough at this point?
no, they're not doing enough. Again, so I would say in terms of incident um, preparation and incident identification and alerting, there's really not a lot outside of performance. So like model monitoring solutions largely focus on performance, like data drift, and is the
Yeah.
model, not just like undesired behavior, like bias, that's not really there. It's like, anyway.
But nowadays, most companies, I would imagine, monitor social media. So
Exactly. Well, and so, but you can't have that. So, like, the main problem is think about how many users it takes to interact with the system for one user to take a picture and then put it on social media. Like, I don't know what the numbers are. It's a very bad way of relying on identification. And then I would just also say that you don't want that. Like, in addition to whatever the harms are, then you're suddenly worried about public relations and reputational harms. It's a bigger incident if you have to wait till something bad happens on Twitter. And I mean, we're still talking about those things. And so anyway, it's not
And
what you.
obviously, just defining what an incident is will help you detect it. So just defining what an incident is, can, do you find that people are able to do that on their own? Or I guess that's why you folks at Luminos.ai are building tools, right? So to help them kind of hone in on just the definitional aspects, probably, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's like the policy component of it where you need to think about it. Some companies can really do this well on their own. Then there's also the actual tooling component of it, which is like, what is it that actually constitutes an incident? And I'll give you some examples of ones that have kind of some legal angles to them. Obviously, fairness, discrimination, bias, these are all major issues. There's privacy issues. I mean, this happens more frequently than it should, but language models in particular, but also, other multimodal models can incorporate, sensitive or potentially identifying information. There's a really interesting example from a South Korean chatbot called Lee Luda this was many years ago. It was taken offline. Different users were having conversations with the model, and it started to leak conversations between users and identify users in a way it shouldn't have. That stuff still goes on. So that's privacy. There's copyright infringement. This happens actually a lot with the multimodal models. I mean, the text ones, but also just generating images or audio or video. It's very easy to do that. There are basically a variety of ways that you can run into legal issues. And so those are really I would say those are the clearest ones where lawyers get involved. But there are a bunch of different types of incidents. And again, the worst thing you can do is have to figure out what is an incident and how do you contain it and how do you respond once you're seeing people flagging it on social media. Because this is what we see with clients and companies who use the Luminos.ai platform is they'll see something on Twitter and it will be scary and everybody will be alarmed and the chief data officer and the board will get involved and everybody will basically be freaking out. And that's just like the day of, you start seeing images on social media. And then pretty soon you're seeing articles in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or wherever it is. And then you're seeing it on TV and it basically just expands. And nobody wants that. It makes it a lot harder to actually figure out what's going on. The pressure goes up. So basically, you don't want to be looking at images on social media and have the board worried and saying, is this an incident? You don't want that. It's terrible. You want to know what an incident is, and then you want to know what to do.
So basically, so for listeners who want to start getting serious about this topic, I guess they can go to both Luminos.Law and Luminos.ai. But do you folks provide any resources? Like, do you do webinars? So where can they get a hold of the team?
So it's all coming. I would just say, if you're interested, like, feel free to reach out to Luminos.ai or Luminos.law. It's literally just contact@Luminos.law or contact@Luminos.ai. .law is like legal services. .ai is the actual platform. So you can reach out to us for more information. We are going to be releasing a lot of material soon. The research we've been doing for NIST is going to come out in the next couple of months. I am currently writing a very long explanation, basically a playbook of like, you've never done incident response for AI. Here's what to do. So a lot of that is coming. It's not yet available. So if listeners are interested, feel free to reach out directly. And then otherwise, just basically stand by. And all of that's coming in the next month or two.
All right. So then in closing, let me just tell you why my objection to SB 1047, and then we'll close. So SB 1047, right? So I wrote a piece about it. It's big. It's a bit too open-ended for my taste. They're talking about creating a frontier model division. I don't know, things are moving too fast. Now, on the other hand, if you want to regulate certain applications, that's what you should do, right? So just like self-driving cars, maybe NHTSA should regulate that, right? So specific applications, I think that's very reasonable to do, right? So if the generative AI model is going to do something specific, or the foundation model is going to do being used for some specific application, in many instances there's already a regulator anyway, right? So, but to regulate the actual frontier model, foundation model, when things are moving so fast, we don't even know how to properly test it at this point, right? So this is something you folks are doing a lot of work on, right? So to lay down kind of regulations at this point, I don't know, it sounds like a bit early to me. What's your sense?
Okay. I want you to get it all off your chest, and I want to give you as much airtime to
Yeah.
talk about how terrible a law it is. I mean,
So
honestly,
like I said, so I'm making the distinction between regulating the applications, right? So, but then the frontier model, everyone knows the space is changing so fast, right?
yeah. So, okay, so I will say, like, the strength of the way we approach regulations in the US is exactly what you're saying, which
Yeah.
is specific.
Yeah.
There are financial regulators.
Yeah.
There are regulators for just like human resources and employment. There are regulators for, drugs.
Transportation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
transportation, drugs. So that is a very, very, very good approach. It's worked. It helps, implement safety standards. I mean, like Federal Aviation Administration. So like that's how we do it. It helps both increase safety standards and encourage innovation. So historically, it's great. The Europeans have taken the opposite approach. We're going to regulate the technology, and then, so it's much more centralized. And so California has largely been following, they call it the Brussels effect, like what the EU does. The one thing I will say in defense of that, though, I share your skepticism, is the main problem that we're starting to have is we're having a few major players who are developing these models. And this is just software writ large. We're seeing the same trend. And for efficiency's sake, you can regulate every use case, which is going to basically be the people who are buying and adopting these models. And they're going to be thousands or tens of thousands or maybe millions of them. And if something is wrong with the model or what they're doing, you can go after all of those different users, which is super inefficient, or you can go to the...
But applications though, specific apps, or what you're saying is, or we can regulate the model using the same people who run the DMV.
Yes. Oh, well, no. I am firmly against expanding powers of DMVs.
No, I mean the same kind of bureaucracy, the level of bureaucracy. So, I mean, if you go so broad, right? So, I don't know.
I mean, we need to be really careful, because if you get these regulations wrong, you're going to really, really screw up the technology, and nobody wants that. On the other hand, you don't want to like let it run wild. But there definitely is, I would say definitely in the EU and in some states, there's a rush to try to figure out what to do. And there's a lot that can go wrong. But also, on the other hand, there is a rush to just deploy these technologies as fast as possible, and that's also not good. And so I'm gonna go back to the central theme of this talk, which is it's very important to prevent AI from doing bad things, but it's just as important to be able to figure out what's going on and then stop it once that happens. And so like that is the future. That's where things are going. You can't stop incidents from occurring. And so you need to be thinking about how you're going to detect it. And so I think the laws that are
and as you alluded to, I mean, people are aware of this fact in the software world, right? It's just that now it's AI infused software, but and I think having the moniker AI, people might have some unrealistic expectation for accuracy or for delivering the kinds of results that they expect. But the reality is it's also still software. It will fail. It will fail. And so anyway, thank you, Andrew. And it's great to end the discussion about SB 1047 with an expert who agrees with me. And with that, thank you.
Exactly. Thanks for having me.